I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love. And I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them.
Shalom, shalom. It's Brother Tyndall from Something to Chew On coming in. Going to do another read-along video and most definitely give you something to chew on this week. I'm going to go ahead and tell you up front, I'm going to give you a trigger warning. Some people will be triggered by the content of this video. So prepare yourselves. But before we get into it, let's do the read-along update and get that out of the way. Okay? The last video playlist I made was the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, however you want to label it. Very short book, and each chapter was very short. Got it done, no problem. They've all been uploaded onto the channel, and the playlist is there. The link will be in the description below, along with all the other links. Okay, last week, the vote on hand was between Esther and the book of Romans. And it was a landslide. Romans won. Okay, now, with that said, I saw through the week, I was monitoring how many votes was coming in, and I saw that Esther wasn't getting any votes. So I sat down yesterday, and I went ahead and made the book of Romans. It's finished, complete. All the videos are made. I simply have to upload them to YouTube. And I'll do that, as always, most high willing, in the next 3 or 4 days. Most likely on Wednesday. I've gotten into the habit of uploading a new playlist on Wednesday, so that'll probably be when I'll do it. Okay, now, with that said, the vote this week, I got to looking at my list. I've got me a little checklist, and I've checked off all the ones that I've made so far, and I was going through looking at it, and I'm almost finished with the entire Tanakh, or the Old Testament. I got the minor prophets, which are really short. And in fact, I've actually already made the video for Obadiah. Considering it's only got 1 chapter, I just sat down one day and did it, and it was over with. And I've got it stored. I just haven't uploaded it. I'll probably do that, sometime in the future. But the ones that are left in the Old Testament, like Job and 2nd Chronicles, those are longer books. The other ones, like the minor prophets, they're short. So, but with all that said, I'm kind of rambling. With all that said, the vote this week, I'm going to put Esther back on the table. But I'm also going to put 2nd Chronicles on the table. It's one of the longer books. So, as always, pause the video and go vote in the comment section below. Esther or 2nd Chronicles. That's the vote for this week. Now, with that all said, that's that. Now, let's get into this. Like I said, trigger warning. There will be people watching this who will be triggered. Now, I simply say this. Before you allow your flesh to react, take a breath and listen to what the Ruach is saying. Okay? Now, I'm going to preface it with this. I am not saying in any means what I'm about to say is correct. I'm simply asking a question. Posing a question to cause the viewers to chew on. To give them something to chew on. Okay? Because this is a very touchy subject when it comes to... So it's a touchy subject no matter what. You have people on either end of the spectrum, I guess you would say. But it deals with false gods. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you, I'm not talking about, I know there are people out there who do not use the lords and the gods. That's the way it's often phrased. They don't say Lord and they don't say God. That's not what this is about. This has nothing to do with that. This has to do with the names of false gods. Two separate subjects. They are similar, but they are two separate subjects. So don't let that come, the confusion come in on that. Okay? Now, I'll say this. This is where it come up. And if you're one of the people that were involved in this post, hey, I'm not mentioning any names. This is an example I've seen. I've seen examples of this in the past, but this is the most recent one. And I thought, you know what? Let's just make a video about this. So if you're watching, I am not calling you out by any means. I'm simply giving you and others, like I said, I'm not calling anyone out. I'm giving y'all something to chew on, to consider what the text actually says. Okay? In light of what we think it may be saying. Okay? I seen a post this week. Somebody made reference to tennis shoes, sneakers, Nike brand tennis shoes. And for those who don't know, let me preface this. For those who don't know, Nike is the name of the Greek goddess of victory. Okay? Hence where that company got the name for their shoes. Meaning their shoes are supposed to represent victory. Makes sense? That's where that comes from. But I seen a post, somebody posted about Nike brand shoes, and there were people in the comments that basically said, you're not supposed to say the name of false gods. And they make reference to a specific verse. Okay. Now, with that said, like I said, trigger warning. Some of you have probably already been triggered because I've said the word Nike, and that's the name of a false god. But let's actually look at this text, and then let's consider what else the Torah, the first five, the Torah proper, what it actually has to say about this. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see. Like I said, I'm definitely going to give you something to chew on. But let's go look at the verse. The verse in question that most often gets brought up when it comes to this subject is Exodus 23 and verse 13. So let's bring it up. I'm going to bring this up in the... actually, let's do this. I'll set this up. I had it so I could bring it up in the King James. But I'm going to bring it up in both the King James and the Scripture Version 2009. And we'll be able to read them side by side in parallel. All right, so let's transition over and let's look at this. Okay, hang on. Here we go. Okay, like I always do. When I'm going to do a parallel like this, I let you see. So you see what's going on. Exodus 23, and over here we have the Scripture Version 2009. Over here we have King James. We understand that. Now, let's scroll down to the verse in question. Like I said, Exodus 23 and verse 13, right here. Now, we can read this out of either one. Doesn't matter. Let's just read it out of the King James. It says this right here. It says, and in all things that I have said unto you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of thy mouth. Right? Now, Scripture Version 2009 basically says the same thing, but instead of using the word gods, they say mighty ones. All right, let's just read that. It says, in all things that I have said to you, take heed, and make no mention of the name of other mighty ones. Let it not be heard from your mouth. Okay, now that verse, in the post I'm talking about, that verse was referenced. But I often see that verse referenced basically to say, we're not even supposed to say Nike. I'm just using that as an example. That's an in general example. You could take that to mean all kind of other words. There are so many words. Here's the thing. A lot of people know this. I know a lot of you know this. There are numerous words that, whether we know it or not, are actually names of false gods, other mighty ones. Nike is just an example most people know. I mean, you could name any of the Greek gods. Zeus, Hera, Dionysus. What's some of the other? Aphrodite. And then you could go down to Roman gods. Saturn, Venus. Basically, all planets are, quote unquote, named after Roman gods. Days of the week have their origins in false gods. And I know some people don't say days of the week. They don't like using the names of the days of the week. I get it. I understand it. I understand where you're coming from. Okay? But this verse is so often used to justify not saying these names. Okay? And I get it. On the surface, that's what it appears as if it's saying. But let's take into consideration something else that's written in the Torah itself. Okay? All right, now let me bring this up. Hang on. Before I transition, let me bring this up. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 11, if I'm not mistaken. No. Hang on, I got it broke down. It's Deuteronomy 31, verse 11. I was one chapter off. Okay, now I'm going to leave this. I'm going to leave this set in that parallel version. And, 2009 and King James. And like I said, when I transition, you'll see it, and then we'll scroll down to the verse. Okay. All right, like I said, Deuteronomy 31. On this side is the scripture version 2009. On this side is the King James. Now, let's scroll down to verse 11. The verse in question here. Actually, let's read verses 10 and 11 because it's kind of one big long sentence, right? Okay, I'll read this from the King James over here on this side. It says, "And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, in the solemnity, I can't pronounce that word. It won't come off my tongue. Solemnity, I guess, of the year of release, in the Feast of Tabernacles." Basically, what it's saying is that every 7 years during the sabbatical year, during the Feast of Tabernacles, or Booths, however you want to call it, or Sukkot, many of you will know it by that. It says, and in verse 11 it says, "When all Israel is come to appear before Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh thy Elohim, in the place which he shall choose." What it's talking about is the temple, because when this was written, the Most High had not chosen yet where the temple would be built. But that's what this is speaking of. In the place he will choose, meaning the Most High will choose to put his name. That's the way it says it in a lot of places. But that's not what I'm talking about here. But anyway, it says, "Thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing." Okay. Let's read that all together one more time without me expounding on anything. And listen carefully to what it says. It says, "And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, in the solemnity of the year of release, in the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel is come together before Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh thy Elohim, in the place which he shall choose, thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Do we see what that is saying? It's saying that every 7 years, when you have the Feast of Sukkot, you are to read the law in their hearing. So, in order for something to be read and someone be able to hear it, that means it has to be read aloud. It has to be spoken out loud in order for someone else to hear it. Do we catch that? Right? Now, with that in mind, every 7 years, they were to read the Torah out loud at the Feast of Sukkot. Now, with that said, let's go look at a few verses that are actually in the Torah itself. Notice, every verse I'm using today is coming straight from the quote-unquote Torah proper. Genesis through Deuteronomy. I'm not drawing from the Psalms. I'm not drawing from the writings, the prophets, none of that. Strictly the Torah. Okay? Now let's look to some verses in the Torah. And remember what Exodus 23:13 says. Actually, let's pull that back up and look at that one more time. Right here. Let's look at it again. It said, in all things that I have said to you, unto you be circumspect, and make no mentions of the names of other gods, or other mighty ones, neither let it be heard out of thy mouth. Right? On the surface, it seems to be saying, do not say Nike. Why? Because Nike is the name of a other god, or a other mighty one, a false god, if you will. On the surface, that's what it seems to be saying. But Deuteronomy said that every 7 years they have to read aloud the Torah itself. Okay? Now, like I said, let's go look at a few verses that are in the Torah, which must be read aloud every 7 years. Do we see this? They're all highlighted. Numbers 22, verse 41. And it came to pass on the morrow, and these are from the, this is from the King James Version, what I copied and pasted here. I copied and pasted all these verses so you could see them all in one place instead of me having to go look them all up. But Numbers 22:41, and it came to pass on the morrow that Balak took Balaam and brought him up into the high place of Baal, or Baal, that thence he might see the utmost part of the people. Baal, that's the name of another mighty one, of another god. And it's right there in the Torah, which is to be read aloud every 7 years. Do we see the apparent contradiction? If we're not to have these names of these other gods on our mouths, but yet we're to read the Torah every 7 years, and the Torah itself contains the name of other gods, do we see the apparent contradiction? All right? Now, to drive this home, let's just look at a few more. Chemoth, or Shemoth, however you want to pronounce it. Numbers 21:29. Woe to thee, Moab! Thou art undone, O people of Chemoth. He hath given his sons that escaped and his daughters into captivity, of Shion, king of the Amorites. We see this is a name of another God, another mighty one. Numbers 21:29, within the Torah proper, which is to be read aloud every 7 years. So again, I ask, if we are not to say literally the name of other mighty ones, then how can the Torah be read aloud every 7 years when it has the name of another mighty one? We're commanded not to say those names, but yet we're commanded to read those names aloud. Do we see the apparent contradiction? Let's go to another one, last one. Leviticus 18:21. Notice the rest of them are all in Leviticus, and they all are considering the same Molech. Leviticus 18:21. And thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy Elohim. I am Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Again, I ask the question, if we're not to say the names of other gods, but yet the Torah itself commands us to read the Torah out loud every 7 years, and the Torah itself contains the name of other mighty ones, other gods, how is that to be done? There is an apparent contradiction if we are not to say the names of other gods, but yet the names of other gods are in the Torah, which we are to read aloud every 7 years. Do we see the apparent contradiction? Now, like I said, trigger warning. Some people's cognitive dissonance is kicking in heavily. Some people have probably stopped the video. They're going to unsubscribe. Hey, that's fine. Like I said, don't let your flesh get upset, but take a breath and hear what the Spirit may be saying. Okay? Now, let's go back and actually look at that verse in Exodus 23 and verse 13 to see if we can't maybe dig a little deeper as to what it might actually be saying. Now remember, like I said in the beginning, what I'm going to present to you I'm not presenting it as a fact hardcore. I'm simply giving you something to go chew on and to go study. Because I have pointed out a seeming contradiction in the Torah itself. You're not supposed to say the names of other gods, but yet the Torah has the names of other gods in it, which we are commanded to read out loud. And that would mean we would have to say the names of other gods, in opposition to Exodus 23:13 that says don't say the names of other gods. Do we see the contradiction? The seeming contradiction that is glaring in our face. There's no way around it. Like I said, somebody's cognitive dissonance is kicking in right about now. Their flesh is their flesh is rearing its ugly head. But like I said, take a breath and hear what the Ruach has to say. And let's go look at Exodus 23:13 and see if maybe, perhaps there's something else being said in this verse. Okay? Let's go back to it. Now, what you see here, for those who don't know, these purple numbers, they are the Strong's numbers. Most of my viewers will know what that means. Some of you may not. The Strong's Concordance, you can look up a word, the English word, and it will give you the Hebrew, considering we're dealing with the Tanakh or the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, it'll give you the Greek. What it does, you look up the English word in whatever verse, and it will show you what the Hebrew word actually is in the manuscripts. And it will give you the definition of that Hebrew word. Right? We often hear, especially in the Torah observant community. I'll say it that way. Messianic Hebrew roots, full Bible movement, however you want to label it. Torah observant. We'll just go with that. You often hear people say, well, you got to read in context. And hey, and I say that too. People say, you can't cherry pick a verse out of context. Yep, I agree. You often hear this one right here. You got to understand the verse from a Hebraic mindset. Hey, I say that too, and I agree. And you hear this one, and I say this one all the time. But you hear people use this concept of what I'm about to explain. They'll say, you cannot impart your 21st Greco-Roman Western world mindset or definition of a word into the text when you see the word. No, go look the word up in its original language and see what it means. Because the way you define it with the way we define it, I'll include myself in this, the way we define these words via our English, Western world, 21st century mindset, most often is not the way the Hebraic word behind it in the original text means. The definitions are not the same. We try to impart our 21st century understanding onto the text, when that's not what the text is saying. And this seems to be a perfect example of this. And like the reason I brought this up, people will say, well, you got to think Hebraically. Yep, you do. But are we still not guilty of doing that? We try to impose our 21st century understanding of a word onto the text and not looking to the Hebrew to see what the word means. Perfect example. The word name. In our minds, in the Western world mindset, we think of name, spelling, pronunciation. My name is Stephen. That's what we think. Perhaps, just perhaps, that's not what this verse is talking about in Exodus 23. Perhaps that word name in the Hebrew means something else. Let's look and see. All right, let's bring it back up. Like I said, Strong's numbers. You can see it right there above my mouse. It says, of the name. And it says Strong's number H8034. Now I can hover over it and it'll bring it up. But I can also go to the dictionary where it'll be on the screen fully and we can read what it says. This is from the Strong's Concordance. There's how the word would look in Hebrew. There's the pronunciation. But let's read what it says. It says, a primitive word, perhaps rather from H7760, through the idea of a definite and conspicuous position. Compare. It says an appellation as a mark or memorial of individuality. Okay, now let's read this part right here very carefully. By implication, honor, authority, and character. Let's read it one more time. By implication, honor, authority, or character. Notice, nowhere in there does it say anything about the spelling. My name is spelled with a PH, not a V. It doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't say anything about the pronunciation of a name. It speaks to the character and authority that the name bestows. Okay? I so often see people The same people that will say you have to read the Bible in the Hebraic mindset will be the same ones that will use this word name and apply their 21st century definition to that word, when the Hebrew really doesn't mean that. The Hebrew deals with the authority and the character associated with that name. Do we see that? So, maybe, just maybe, Exodus 23:13 is not telling us to not say Nike, not say Baal, not say Chemoth, not say Molech. Why? Because we already saw that the Torah also commands us to read the Torah out loud, and within the Torah are the names of these other gods, which would be pronounced and said out loud. But Exodus 23 says, you can't say them. Like I said, back to the contradiction. Perhaps what Exodus 23 is actually saying, it doesn't have to do with saying the name Molech, Baal, Chemoth, Stephen, Nike, whatever. What it has to do with is the authority behind the name, giving authority to these false gods. Meaning, saying Nike does not give any authority to that false god. Now, if one said, I worship Nike, hey, maybe that is what is prohibiting. You're not supposed to give authority. By you saying you worship that, you give it authority. But simply saying Nike, Baal, or whatever in a conversation, you're not giving that false god authority. Does that make sense? Like I said, I know that probably triggered a whole lot of people. Like I said, don't let your flesh rear its ugly head. Take a breath and listen to what the Ruach is saying. Now, with that in mind, I'll say this. The Hebrew word name refers to character and authority. Same too does the Greek word. So when you read through the Brit Hadashah or the New Testament and it says things about name, most often it's not talking about spelling and or pronunciation. It's talking about authority. I'll leave it at that. But chew on it. Like I said, before your flesh wants to rear its ugly head, take a breath and let the Ruach speak. And realize, if we are to read in a Hebraic perspective, that means we cannot impart our 21st century definitions into the text and define a word via our 21st century mindset. The word name from the Hebrew has nothing to do with pronunciation and or spelling. It has to do with character and authority. Wrap your mind around that. But like I said, something to chew on. I'll leave it at that for this week. And remember, the vote this week, Esther or 2 Chronicles. And I'll end this like I end every video. Don't just chew on this thing. Or don't just read this thing, but chew on it. Shalom, shalom, folks.